Springsteen's face white. Plus, we'll hear the world radio debut of unreleased material from the forthcoming re-release of The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. It's a quarter century of David Bowie's most fascinating changes. Hearing Pictures, David Bowie's sound and vision on Timothy White's Rock Stars.
There's something about the English. They don't want to be seen to be normal or average. There's a desperation to sort of get away from being middle of the road or being taken as being a representative of the next guy. You know, it's like almost desperately that the idea of being the average Joe is like so reprehensible. We were sort of tending to start to read weird things. So I was coming across stuff in bookshops like Jack Kerouac and Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg, all at around the age of like 13 and 14. So I was sort of led and introduced by the more kind of artistically oriented society that I'd found myself in into really great stuff very early on. So that was kind of a real help, and it changed my ideas about what you could do with rock. I'd got to a position where I'd gone through 2 or 3 bands and not been happy with what I was doing, and I'd been working very much in sort of mixed media things around London. And I found myself basically with just a guitar, and to get any kind of audience, the folk thing was sort of somewhere to go. And as you can tell, I mean, I didn't do much in that area because I didn't feel, 1, I was very good at it, and 2, it didn't appeal to me very much, but I did try it for a bit. I never ever thought that my songs would help anybody think or know anything. The idea of my songs was that it would be interesting for me to be in that position. How would I feel if I were doing that? So I'd write it from that stance.
I'm Timothy White here in the studio with David Bowie.
In stereo.
And David, we just heard Sound and Vision, the song that is the title of your 1990 tour. And I know you have the Adrian Belew Band with you to help give your catalog of material a revamped sound.
It would have been pretty precious to kind of duplicate the original single or album sounds. Adrian Belew has got his own particular kind of band sound. There's been attested over the last year with the Mr. Music Head album.
Right.
It's a great band. And it seemed kind of discourteous to try and have him ape everything that had already been done. So it made sense as Adrian wanted to work with me on this thing, that it would be great if Adrian did the things Adrian's way. So he's pretty much treating them with his kind of perception of how they should be played these days, which is kind of nice because I wouldn't really kind of know what to do with them, but I'm just throwing myself in on rhythm guitar and saxophone and a couple of things, and Erdal Kizilki, who's a Swiss-Turkish guy that I've been working with over the last number of years. He worked with me before on Glass Spider Tour and a lot of album stuff and bits and pieces. He's come in on bass, as Adrian's band doesn't have a bass. It's 3-piece, drums, keyboards, and Adrian. Altogether, there's 5 of us playing, 4 most of the time, but me sometimes.
And it's a very stripped-down sound. It's just rock and roll from the boards up.
I wonder. Rock and roll, I'm not sure that I'm a rock and roll person.
Well, let's talk about that.
It's, I think, less and less rock and roll. I hear less and less rock and roll. In fact, I hear less rock. It's kind of segmenting up now, isn't it, into sort of ethnic musics, metal and pop music. I think pop music is back with a passion. A lot of the stuff that I wrote in the past, listening back to it, is very pop-oriented. Things like Changes and Life on Mars and those kinds of things, they're pop songs.
Listening to some of that wonderful stuff that's coming out on CD in the Ryko disc re-releases, yeah, they were pop songs and folky in some ways, but still, it was always with a dimensionality there that ignored any kind of neat strictures that people were most comfortable with.
I wasn't actually ever convinced that I had a territory. All music was fun to me, and it never occurred to me that I should have one style. I mean, that never really sunk home to me. I guess that's why I've never developed a musical style. The polite word's eclectic, I guess.
Well, among the variety of new material coming out this year is Fame 90, a remix of that classic track from the Young Americans album. And let's set history straight. What prompted you, Carlos Alomar, and John Lennon to write that song?
I remember very clearly the process. We had been working on stage with a thing by an old single by the Flares called Foot Stomping, and the riff that Carlos had developed for it I found fascinating. I kept telling him, I said, that's a waste to do it on somebody else's song. We should use that riff on something. And we were playing it for John in the studio. He came down for the day and said, what do you reckon of this riff, John? Ding, 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 ding. And he was going, I'm, and he was playing along with it, and he was just sort of muttering to himself in a corner, and it just all fell into place. Fame, that's great, John. Hey, John helped us write this song called Fame. And it kind of came like that, and he carried on playing rhythm guitar, and we just put the thing together. Hey, let's do the show right here. It was a real Mickey Rooney thing, you know.
That's so great.
And it just all came together in about 15, 20 minutes, the whole backing track and the idea of Fame, and I just ran away and wrote the lyrics for it. And the next day, John came down again and said, you know, how's it going, that one? You know, it was real. That was real good, that one, you know.
Such a great groove, too. God bless. I mean, so many people have tried to rip off that groove ever since.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess James himself would tell me, but I understand that James Brown took it into a studio and did a single within a couple of weeks of hearing the thing. Because, you know, Carlos used to work with James Brown.
Ah.
He was in the Carlos. Somehow the tapes got back to him, and he went and did one, and I think that's about the only time in my life that I really feel proud of being sort of that influential in somebody else's record.
Well, let's listen to one of the new remixes from the 12-inch of Fame 90. That was Fame 90 from David Bowie. I'm Timothy White here in the studio with David, and when we come back, we'll be listening to an unreleased track from the forthcoming Ziggy Stardust CD. Stick with us. And David, the forthcoming Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust CD is going to have 5 bonus tracks, all of them unreleased. And I know you have one in mind to premiere for us now.
There was one called Sweethead, which didn't get on the original album. That was the oral sex song that RCA just thought that maybe, no, we shouldn't put that on. But these days, sort of, it's probably as bad. I don't know. Probably get a sticker on it now.
That was the world radio premiere of Sweethead from David Bowie's forthcoming Ziggy Stardust CD. We're in the studio with David Bowie, and David, a lot of people may not realize that even though Ziggy Stardust came out after the Hunky Dory album, a lot of the Ziggy LP was recorded prior to Hunky Dory.
A lot of it, yeah. It was in there somewhere, and I wanted to take my time over it, so sort of Hunky Dory was a sort of an interim project to get me through the recording contract, which meant I had to have an album out. So I did Hunky Dory to sort of... But there were some great songs on Hunky Dory. But I think I did about half of the Ziggy album before.
At that hunky-dory period when you were thinking about that concept, first of all, no one had ever looked upon rock and roll careerism in such a brutal way. It was probably the most honest, self-contemplating perspective on rock and roll that anybody had taken.
We'd sort of been snowballed with realism and honesty and all these things that came out of the late 60s into the 70s, and by that time it had got kind of really boring. I said it would be such great fun to kind of fabricate something so totally unearthly and unreal and have it living as an icon, you know, and it sort of Ziggy came out of that thinking, really.
Yeah, the whole idea of this sort of punk alien, you know, this kind of rock and roll android who would just sort of come amongst us and be a mirror for, like, our best and worst sides.
Even though it was a fabrication, and the actual writing of it, I think any writer imbues his writing with a sense of himself and how he feels about himself at the time. So I think a lot of it comes out of my own problems with how I felt about me, and it was a way of creating myself, you know, building from the ground up. I mean, the whole idea of the Who's line about hope I die before I get old. I mean, again, at that age, that sort of, that time was a very sort of potent factor. You cannot believe the thing about sort of that you'll lose the ability to be this enthusiastic and this all-knowing about the world and life and experience, which you are at that sort of in your 20s. You think you've probably discovered all the secrets to life, or at least half the way there to discovering them. And I had a passion for the idea of the meteor as a rock star, or the rock star as a meteor.
Suffragette City from David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust LP. David, do you remember the day that Sue Fussy, the hairdresser, dyed your hair bright red for the Ziggy character?
Yeah. I think we went through a number of colours, actually. I bet we did end up on red. We had tried green. I know green was one of the colours that we tried, but red was the one that we stuck with. If I remember rightly, London was all agog at a new young Japanese designer called Kansai Yamamoto. He was sort of the cutting edge of the avant-garde fashion designers out of Japan. Nobody would buy his stuff, but everybody would go and see his shows because they were just spectacular. And he just unleashed all these new kabuki-inspired clothes on London, and one of his models had the kabuki lion's mane on her head, this bright red thing, and I said, that's just so great. Let's go red. Ziggy's going to have bright red hair. So it was all Kansai's fault, and then I got in contact with Kansai, and he made all the original clothes for us for the early Spider shows. I still have every single one of those things, and they're museum pieces.
Did you hit the street with that haircut after it was done, the red haircut?
With much deliberation, yeah. It was an area called Tottenham Court Road, which was the Tin Pan Alley of London at the time. There was only really one street where bands hung out on, and that was Denmark Street, just off Tottenham Court Road. It didn't get the kind of response that you'd imagine at the time, because there were quite a few eccentrics in London in one way and another, and it was just an eccentric person. It's only when this eccentric person went up on stage and started singing that it had that kind of, riveting effect.
You were one of the first people to have dress-alikes come to the concerts in droves after a while.
That was an extraordinary phenomenon. It really was.
That was Starman from David Bowie's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust album. The original master from the CD that isn't out until next month. I'm Timothy White here in the studio with David Bowie, and we have more in a moment.
Now back to Hearing Pictures, David Bowie's Sound and Vision, with our host, Timothy White, and his special guest, David Bowie.
One of the things I was very struck with looking at your catalog and, how so many of these songs were written is that you found the time on the Ziggy tour to do a lot of writing for Aladdin Sane. How were you able to squeeze anything in during that incredibly chaotic time?
I think when you get caught up in that wave of euphoria that is the initial response to sort of becoming well known, you think that you're quite sure it's only going to last for such a limited amount of time that you sort of cram as much work into it in case your spot goes and you lose your place in the queue, and it's sort of, you just, God, I better write, well, I've got the chance, I better just write and write and write, and that's kind of what you do. 24 hours a day I was writing and working up ideas for future shows and things before it all suddenly disappeared.
You actually did some recording even in New York and Nashville. I think you did Gene Genie during the course of the Ziggy tour. Was it prompted by anything in particular?
Well, Gene Genie, during that period I just met Iggy Pop, and it was just this kind of character out of Detroit, and trying to verbalize him in some way and sort of respond to the kind of image that I had of him. And the play on words obviously was Jean Genet, but that was just a throwaway pun.
Another song with a little bit of Detroit background to it was Panic in Detroit, which you performed in a boxing ring.
The initial song was written, sniping was quite the vogue. I remember there were snipers all over America on tops of buildings shooting everybody, and it's sort of part of life's rich pattern at the time. So it was the expression of where it came from, but why on earth I did it with boxing gloves, it just seemed like the right way to do it. If you've got one guy up there with 10,000 people in front, you've got to hit him with something, so I put boxing gloves on. That was, me as the sniper, I guess.
That was Panic in Detroit from David Bowie's 1973 Aladdin Sane album. David, let's go back into your earliest bands and influences. In 1973, I believe, you quit one of your first bands, the Conrads, because they wouldn't play R&B, right?
Yeah, I know the exact song. It was Marvin Gaye's Can I Get a Witness? They wouldn't play it. They said, we do Shadows numbers and Cliff Richard. And so we had a kind of fairly bitter fight about it. And I said, no, you're so stupid. This music is so exciting. It's so great, you know. And
what was the first R&B or blues record that kind of sparked that feeling of intensity on your part that you'd stick up for it?
Screaming Jay Hawkins, I Put a Spell on You. That
boy.
was just wonderful.
You'd be afraid to be in a room by yourself with that record.
Yeah, that and the other one that made a big impression was Alan Freed rock and roll band, Right Now, Right Now. Dee 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 do 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 do. Right now, right now. It was like a big band thing.
Did you have an allowance or something so you could buy these records?
7 shillings and 6pence a week.
What would you
In
do
those
for
days.
it around the house?
Very little. No, I had an incredibly generous father.
How would you describe your dad?
He's a very kind, sensitive man, very sensible, and a strong commitment to the company that he worked for, which was a children's home, Dr. Bernardo's children's home. He'd been through quite a lot in his own life, I think. He took a theatre company around England one time, which bankrupted him, and then he bought a nightclub in London, tried to run that, and then he decided to commit himself to helping children. Unfortunately, he died before the point where we were intimate with each other, which was always a great sadness to me.
What was your mom like?
She was fairly authoritarian. We were never particularly close. We're probably a lot closer now, but the years have brought that on. But during the formative years, I don't think we were particularly close.
Were you frisky as a kid? Were you a handful, as they say?
No, I wasn't. I was really quiet and probably more frustrating because I would never say what was on my mind. I was very happy in a book. I could just sit with a book forever. I still do. Always felt that one was on the edge of events and on the fringe of things and kind of left out, you know, that kind of feeling. And a lot of my figures and the characters in those early years seemed to revolve around that one feeling. I felt very ephemeral. I didn't feel substantial. I didn't have a particular sense of self. It seemed that I had to extract pieces from around me and put them onto myself to create a person. I was having a real problem with that. I'd felt kind of invisible.
How'd you come to write that song, Can't Help Thinking About Me, when you were with that band, The Lower Third, circa 1966?
The invisible me. Because I was a kid, and that's what you write about a lot when you're that age.
It's such a great title.
Yeah, that's a 19-year-old kind of song.
Can't Help Thinking About Me, a rare 1966 rock from David Jones in The Lower Third. We know him now as David Bowie. We'll be back with him in a moment. New Hearing Pictures, David Bowie's Sound and Vision. David, we were speaking earlier about your childhood. I know it was kind of a lonesome one. And what do you think was the creative breakthrough in your upbringing?
The first thing that meant more to me than anything else in the world was being told that just newly opened in our area was the first art school for 11 to 12-year-olds, which was like an experiment in the south of England. And the guy who initiated that was a guy called Owen Frampton, who was Peter Frampton's father. And he thought it would be worthwhile that anybody that showed any kind of artistic inclination should be able to be trained from a younger age. And I thought, I can go to art school at 12. I jumped at it.
Would this be a Bromley Technical School?
That's right, yeah.
How did you spend your days in school?
Thinking about how I was going to be a rock and roll singer. More than anything else. I mean, was I going to be a rock and roll singer or was I going to be John Coltrane?
Well, that raises a good point because a lot of people may not realize that you're a saxophone player. Besides John Coltrane, who would your major saxophone influences have been?
At that time, I tried passionately to believe that I loved Eric Dolphy. Who, in fact, I didn't until a few years after that. But so I forced myself to listen to modern jazz players. And it was really hard because there was nobody around me who was passionately fond of modern jazz. And it was so difficult because the stuff was so sophisticated.
Yeah.
And then, fortunately, Little Richard sort of came on, and hearing his sax lineup and sax players, I understood that sax playing. I understood what that was about.
Well, David, let's listen to a 1974 track where you hold forth on saxophone. Rebel Rebel from Diamond Dogs. That was Rebel Rebel from the 1974 Diamond Dogs LP from David Bowie. David, let's talk about a move you made both artistically and physically. In 1976, you went to Berlin after having lived in Los Angeles and gotten into kind of a wild lifestyle. What was that time like for you?
It was traumatic. I was having a very bad fight with cocaine, and I was going through a series of very deep depressions in Berlin. And I had an enormous problem in communicating with people right up through that period. It was awfully hard for me to either open up or let other people open up to me. I found a great wall. It was quite ironic, I suppose, that I chose a city with a wall to go and live in. But it did force me into confrontation with other people and normalized situations, well, as normalized as they could have been in Berlin. I mean, I think it became quite self-evident, firstly on the Low album and then again on bits and pieces of Heroes. But you can also feel me coming out of the whole thing during those 4 albums: Low, Heroes, then Lodger, and then finally Scary Monsters. Scary Monsters for me has always been some kind of purge. I mean, it really sort of was eradicating the feelings within myself that I felt uncomfortable with.
Were you saying something like that in Ashes to Ashes?
Yeah, I think very much so, yeah.
That was 1980's Ashes to Ashes on this David Bowie edition of Timothy White's Rock Stars. We'll move to David Bowie's Philadelphia era right after this. I'm Timothy White, back here in the studio with David Bowie. David, after the Diamond Dogs tour, you took up a temporary residence in Philadelphia. You were recording Young Americans, spending a lot of time in the city. What was that like?
I must say that I have very good feelings about Philadelphia. That was a particularly encouraging time because we developed quite a following there, and they would come and hang out at the studio all day long. That was the most social record that I made, I think, because the kids would be waiting outside and we'd let them in, you know, because every day they'd be there and be 10 or 20 of them. And they'd just come into the studio and help out and give ideas and say, that's great, and that ain't so hard and all that. And we had a big end of record party and they all came to that and we played the album mixes. And it was really neat, and we'd go to clubs with them after the day's work and all that.
That's great.
It was really nice. It was lovely.
Well, now the studio we're talking about is Sigma Sound Studio, the famous Gamble and Huff R&B studio. And the record you were working on, I'm told that the original title was One Damn Song, or that was at least one of the titles.
The major title for it was called The Gouster.
The Gouster?
The Gouster.
And what does that mean?
A Gouster was a really slick dude who wore peg pants and cut-off jacket and the chain. In fact, the outfit that went with the Young American album was kind of the very trendy Hispanic look at the time. It was like a shortened-off version of the zoot suit look. That kind of look was on the streets with Hispanics.
One of the many, many great bonuses from all the great CDs you're putting out now with such care. It's hard to be a saint in the city. Springsteen, you did it in 75 in L.A.
Oh, God. I was crazy. When it first came out, Asbury Park was a major album, I thought. I thought it was just a wonderful piece of American songwriting, and I was determined to do at least a track from it. So, in fact, I did 2. I did one with Ronnie Wood called Growing Up, which is going to come out on the Ryko CDs at some point. But the Hard to Be a Saint in the City, we did our version in the studio, and a DJ at the time in Philly said, I know Bruce, shall I bring him down? And I said, that would be great. So he brought him down and we put him in the studio and we played it through to him. And the guy went white. I mean, his face just cleared of blood. And I thought, I don't think he likes this very much. But he was very sweet and very sociable. And I was not all that one could expect from good company at the time. I mean, I was out on my gourd. I remember that very clearly. And if I remember, I had no eyebrows and I was wearing a red beret. And so, I mean, the song was one thing, but encountering me as well was like another. And the poor guy, I mean, like, he was used to, like, hitching rides and doing his sort of Springsteen-y thing with hubcaps, and he kind of meets me. And the DJ valiantly said, well, Bruce, I'll get you back to a hotel now. And my only encounter with Bruce.
Well, let's listen to the David Bowie version of Bruce Springsteen's It's Hard to Be a Saint in the City. And we'll back that up with another track from 1975, Young Americans. David Bowie's Young Americans with David Sanborn as special guest on saxophone. We'll be back with more from David Bowie after this. David, your Sound and Vision anthology and all the album catalog re-releases that have been coming out for Ryko Disc, they're real state-of-the-art examples of what collector's editions can be.
Ryko have an awful lot to do with it. I mean, we were looking around as to who should sort of handle all the old records, and Ryko really seem to be the top company. They take so much care. I mean, they really are terrific.
Well, there's so many treats and so many gems on all these albums as they're coming out. Why don't you pick a track at this point?
All right, here's a song that I probably haven't done for, I think the last time I did it on stage was probably around 1972. We just revived it again with Adrian Belew, and it sounds just as aggressive as it used to sound, but it certainly has a new feeling to it. But here's the original version anyway. It's called John, I'm Only Dancing.
John, I'm Only Dancing, David Bowie from 1972, available now on the Sound and Vision collection. David, let's close the show with your first hit, also from 72, Changes. It had a line in it that seemed to epitomize the exotic rock you were creating back then. Turn and face the strange was the line.
Turn and face the strange. That's a leftover, obviously, from the Jim Morrison, Syd Barrett school of writing. Barrett was a huge influence on me.
Oh, Pink Floyd.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I thought Syd could do no wrong. I mean, I thought he was a wonderful idea of what a rock singer could be about. He's the first guy I ever seen in the early 60s, middle 60s, that decorated himself a stage that had this strange, mystical kind of look to him with black fingernails and painted black fingernails and his eyes fully made up and just sort of weaved around the microphone. I thought, this guy's totally entrancing. It wasn't altogether of this world, you know.
Yeah.
It was so magical. I thought he was terrific. It was so sad that he couldn't continue with the fever that he started with.
I think that's one of the great things that Changes encapsulated in 1972, because it was at the end of the 60s and you seem to be saying, yeah, individuality and doing your own thing, and that may be essential. Maybe that's a worthwhile thing, but how are we going to accommodate each other now?
That's right, yeah. You've broken up the family. You say that, you know, get out of your mind, try and expand yourself and all that. Fine, all right, now you've left us. What are we left with? Here we are, without our families, totally out of our heads, and we don't know where on earth we are. You know, and that was the feeling of the early 70s. Nobody knew where they were. It's changed radically now, but at that time, that's kind of how it felt.
David Bowie, great spending time with you, and the tour is easily the most exciting thing going on in rock and roll in terms of kicking off a brand new decade.
Well, it is in my life.
Great pleasure as always.
Hey, Tim, thank you. I'm out of here.